welcome to a lecture entitled Parametricism by Mr. Patrik Schumacher. This is the second of two sessions for today. The first session we actually had kind of a student workshop and competition where Mr. Schumacher accepted various designs from Thai students. Over 60 submissions were submitted, where Mr. Schumacher picked 6 finalists, and we went through them with the jury, almost like a reality show style. And we picked the winner. You can stand up, Mr. Wichan from Sibatun University. A little bit of information. This lecture is brought to you by Magic Made, a design community whose members are connected through the ever-expanding social network like Facebook. Members of Magic Made are spread across the major cities around the world, including New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, and Bangkok. Magic Made was created by Emika Kanchai, or Kana, so thank you very much, to share inspirations, ideas, and events of design and creativity. A major goal of Magic Made is to create design awareness and inspiration among the general public. I'll give you a little brief background of Mr. Schumacher. Having joined Zaha Hadid Architects in 1988, Patrik Schumacher is a partner and company director of Zaha Hadid Architects. He is the co-author of many of the office's key projects, including the Maxi Center for Contemporary Art and Architecture in Rome, which won the prestigious Sterling Prize in 2010. Another of his key projects was one of the practice's first completed built projects for the Vitra fire station. From 1983, Mr. Schumacher studied architecture at Stuttgart University and at the South Bank University of London. He received his diploma in architecture from Stuttgart University in 1990. He also studied philosophy at Bonn and London universities, and in 1999 received his PhD at the Institute for Cultural Science at the university. He has been teaching at various leading architectural schools throughout the world. He has been the co-director of the Design Research Laboratory at the Architectural Association School of Architecture, or AA, since 1996. He has co-taught various postgraduate design studios with Zaha Hadid at the University of Illinois Chicago, Columbia University, and Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. So without further delay, let me present to you Mr. Patrik Schumacher. 1, 2, 3. Is that?
Great. So parametricism is my term for a new, what I call epochal global style of architecture and all the design disciplines, including urbanism, interior design, furniture, product design, graphic design, including fashion design. And I'm actually working now on a big exhibition to invite all these design disciplines to show how this works across disciplines. I first launched the term in 2008 at the Venice Biennale, but it was retrospective, looking at 10 years of work prior to this, which has been maturing into a global movement. And also, it's happening here in Thailand. The 6 projects I selected are all parametricist projects, including, of course, the winner. Out of the 6, there was about 10, 15 projects I would consider as being part of that movement. So I've exposed myself with trying to summarize what's going on. It's not claiming authority. If anything, it's claiming some kind of interpretive authority of what's going on. And I've got a lot of fans, but a lot of enemies through this as well. So I get these kind of letters, or there are blogs criticizing me and making fun of me. And but it's an interesting lively interaction, and I've actually entered some of these debates and answered some of these blogs. But I want to go back a little bit and discuss and tell you how I started. This image here, these drawings are 25 years old. At that time, we didn't work with a computer, although I had started the computer. At Zaha Hadid Architects, we were just sketching, rapid hand movement, we are painting, and did images like this, urbanism, interiors, projects. These are my drawings of the time. When I first came to London, I was just a student, and I was fascinated, and I learned about Zaha Hadid, who was already very kind of internal hot star in the student scene over 25 years ago. And I joined the office. This is this one room where we were working. This was 4 or 5 people, permanent staff, in the late 80s in an old school building. And I'm still, 25 years later, I'm still sitting on the same desk. And we have still this room, but we bought all the rooms around the whole building, and we also added to another bit. This is Zaha Hadid when I first encountered her in the 80s. Very cool 80s style lady, very stylish, and a true force. I mean, super talent. And I tried to look very cool as well at the time. That's me in the 80s. 25 years ago. So we knew we wanted to do something very stylish. And 1 or 2 years into my doing all these drawings, there was a first client appearing, and I was working on this project, which took us quite a while. It took 3-4 years to complete this building, but it was finished in the early 90s, and we just developed these projects with drawings, sketches, fully by hand. There's no computers involved. And just now, this year, we celebrated 20 years of completion of the project. I'm still trying to look cool there. So then we created a series of projects, first in that kind of more harsh geometric style, but unusual project. It's a housing project in Vienna. And then in the mid-90s, after Vitro was finished, we got more into computers, and we got into more fluid designs, curvilinearity, dynamisms, and we created a whole series of, I think, very beautiful competitions. Maybe were too radical for their time. So this is the mid-90s. All of these competitions were lost. So this is how you build success. You really have to 10 years of losing competition, I promise you, to develop a repertoire and to keep going and losing and doing radical work. Maybe something comes out of it. Of course, there's no guarantee. So these are all the lost competition of the mid-90s. So it became more fluid, it became more radical. And of course, we were still a very small, immature office. And then we started to tone down a little bit and be more hard-nosed in trying to apply that. We had enough of losing. We wanted to win. So we got a series of projects in very short succession. So at the end of the 90s, we won a lot of competition, one after the other. All of these are competition wins. Cincinnati Art Center, the ski jump, the Strasbourg Park and Ride scheme, which, by the way, won the Mies van der Rohe Prize. And you can see here there's a kind of very strong will to form, but it takes care of the pragmatics of a car park, of a train station, and the bus station. And of course we won our major competition at the time. This is in the late 90s, 10 years before the building was completed. The MAXI, the Rome Italian National Contemporary Art and Architecture Museum for the 21st century. And you can see here already that we had perfected at that time 3D modeling using 3D Max to develop these geometries and complex spaces. But at that time, we did not work with algorithms yet. But this one project even is fully within the paradigm of parametricism. This idea of adapting to context, of having a complex field which evolves. 1 year later, we won Wolfsburg Science Center. And now I'm clicking through a series of completed radical projects, I think, which established Zaha Hadid Architects. We moved from a secret name in the student body and in the realm of architecture only to kind of a global brand through these projects. One by one in the late 90s and early 2000s when these projects were completed. In Germany, in Denmark, in Austria. And you can see although they become more fluid, they become more refined, they become more elegant. Zaragoza in Spain, the Chanel Art Pavilion, which moved from Hong Kong to Tokyo to Central Park, New York and Paris. And we made new friends in the process. And you can see what's also important, we always show exterior and interior. And the importance that the interior is very powerful and fluid and dynamic and interacts with the exterior. So it's not only about exterior shape. And we did pure interiors like this one. And now the projects became larger. And again, all of these projects are acquired through competitions, like the Guangzhou Opera House, the first major project in China, which also took about 7 years to build. And it becomes more radical, more fluid, more dynamic. And we started to get into infrastructure and expand our repertoire. It's not only museums, opera house, and cultural buildings, but as you will see later on, we have now all the elements of the built environment within our reach. An interior recently completed in London, our first tower in Marseille, the Aquatic Center in London. And this one I will spend a bit of time later, our currently biggest and most beautiful perhaps and most evolved project in Baku, Azerbaijan. It's a big cultural center including a museum, library, a national library, a conference hall and a musical auditorium. So we got older and we had new friends, and it's a different kind of audience we're trying to integrate with it. But it took us that 10 to 15 years to reach that, and also now have global clients and operating globally. And I think I recommend this, that you don't only work on big projects, but you do products, furniture, smaller things we can finish easy. We've designed about 100 projects per year, but only very few get built. But these come out beautifully. They can be done on the side. They don't take 7 years, 5 years. They take maybe 3-4 months. And we've always done that in the last few years. So there's a lot to show, to fill our spaces, and a lot to show off with. I also want to say this, of course, I mean, I rely on, when it comes to the executing the work now rely on you guys, on young architects, on skilled up architects to help. And my role is now instructing, talking, explaining, maybe doing little doodles. I mean, I used to do the modeling and scripting, but now I'm just doing that. And that's also important. We moved from 4 to 400 people. Okay, I wanted to walk you now through some of the theoretical principles which underlie this work, that build work you saw now, and then I will show you some new projects to illustrate that further. I recommend this. It's very big, but it took me 15 years to write, and I guess you will take about at least a year to read it. It's over 1,200 pages, maybe the longest theoretical book written on architecture so far. Okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about parametricism, meaning that all the elements of architecture become parametrically variable. So we're not talking about rigid figures anymore, but everything is plastic, fluid, malleable, so that it can recognize and react to other forms. So the forms are not hermetic and independent, the forms start to be set into relationship with each other and with the context. That's the meaning and power and beauty of making the elements and figures parametrically variable. So we're moving from a world of these Platonic solids, the cube, the cylinder, the pyramid, which used to compose everything in classical architecture, but as well in modernism. It's always these discrete objects which are just added to each other. They never influence each other, and that's why they never notice each other and are sensitive to each other. So they just agglomerate, and if they agglomerate like today, with a lot of diversity, they generate a kind of urban garbage spill. There's a lack of identity, just these things are piling in, they don't congregate into a legible local order. Here we're talking about the objects being sensitive, they're being interacting with dynamic fields with each other, to attractors, to force fields, and they generate very strong and powerful integral organic orders. And this work I'm showing here is already exactly 20 years old. When we were at Columbia University in '93, we started this process, the next stage, and also Greg Lynn with the blobs started at that year in Columbia University, maybe this 1 year later. So it's very important that this took a while. And I'm showing these again from the animation that to emphasize the difference. When you had these rigid figures, the cubes and cylinders, you draw them with a ruler and a circle. They remain stiff and inert lines. And the way we work with lines is we set them into motion, we set them into arrays, into force fields, and let them configure and self-organize into complex variegated orders. Something it becomes very hard to invent and imagine without these kind of tools. And to some extent you can interpret Rome as an early version of these kind of lines, bundles of lines which flow and bifurcate and intersect and create an exterior complexity and an interior complexity. And you also see that the whole building is brought under this radical formalism of these kind of flow lines, and every element, pragmatic element, is taken up and brought into this artistic process. And that gives you a chance to create a very legible and navigable order. So this is with lines. We have lines, planes, volumes. So in terms of planes, of course, when we work with surfaces now, we're not talking about flat and uninflected plates like floors and stiff mute walls, but we're talking about surfaces which are radiating, which are rippling, which are reacting to impositions and becoming interactive with the environment and differentiating within themselves. And this is the kind of environments we create with these kind of surfaces, where the surface is rippling to create a shelf, to create a bench, which then plays itself free. So the continuously variation of forms of situations rather than just the assembly of preconceived discrete elements. This is a very powerful way of working. In terms of volumes, we have these kind of volumes which bleed into each other, which congregate and create larger unities in a dynamic field. And these are the kinds of projects which are coming out of that, which is all about making connections and creating a continuously differentiated and varying space where with each move the scenery changes, but it changes in a lawful way, in a way you can orient and navigate it. This, I think, very powerful when we're talking about whole swarms of elements, whole groups. They're not kind of repeated, but they're differentiated. So this means that the urban texture can affiliate to an existing context and bring that context into a larger order, at the same time generate very strong differences internally. The modernism would only be able to put something repetitive in the middle, so you have three different zones, and now we have one coherent differentiated. And this is what then comes out of that, when we look further and apply these methods to master plans in Istanbul, in Singapore, in Bilbao, in Libya, in Spain, and London. And you can see when we look at the work in different schools by different students, it is in one spirit, and they all share the sensibility. They all look like organic structures, quite differentiated, fluid. But if you look close, they're very different from each other. So the internal diversity is much richer than the diversity you find in modernism or in classical architecture. Although they all share a set of new physiognomy. And this is Vienna, another studio, another set of students. And again, you can immediately recognize the style, but if you look close, they're very different in terms of the morphology. So there's a much richer potential than in all prior styles. So you have that dialectic of a unity of approach with a radical uniqueness in each of its instantiations. This is the students at the AA. So where there's various teaching arenas that we do the research at the university level to develop radical ideas, try them out across different studios, and then start to apply them at a later stage or in parallel, sometimes with the students coming into the office in the professional projects, and to demonstrate also to clients and to politicians and mayors that what looks so strange has actually a deeper rationality and brings advantages to the cities which employ that. So now I'm going to go through some of the principles which underlie this work, and initially they are just formal principles. What are we talking about? Negative principles, meaning there's not only ways of working at the moment, but we also have to reject old ways of working. We have to say we are not falling back into the old ways. So there's also a series of impositions. Don't do this. So we're no longer doing rigid forms. These kind of elements are excluded from our repertoire because they lack complexity and they lack interaction capacity. So we get rid of that. That's very important. And it's not only that I say you have to get rid of it, it is an observation that for over 10 years we have no longer used these elements. I mean, this whole new generation of architects, the whole office, all the students we're working with, have never used these. So it's also just a description. We no longer do that, but I also say that's good. The next principle is this kind of simple repetition, which is also the default condition in modernism, but also in classical architecture. Usually you have the base repeated, 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 even in the Gothic. So we're saying there's a lack of variety. This doesn't represent contemporary society anymore. So we're also saying that is no longer possible. No simple repetition. And there's another negative principle. I call it the principle of pure difference, which means you just let different elements come together, unrelated, and stay unrelated. That's what I call the garbage spill development. That's actually since the crisis of modernism, since the death of modernism, that's what happened globally. There's no much master planning, no much coherent planning. It's just let everybody place whatever they would like, and that creates a kind of visual chaos, a cacophony of elements, which is disorienting, and in the end, and that's a tragedy, it looks everywhere the same. If you pick up garbage cans from every household, each one has very different things in them, but they all in the end become one spill, one undifferentiated, unrecognizable. So this makes it impossible to generate identity, I would argue. There's simply lack of order, lack of identity, and that's why we also need to reject that. So the problem we're having is this, that we're rejecting everything which classical architecture was doing in terms of rigid forms, repetition, symmetry. We reject everything that modernism is doing, and we also reject everything which has since then happening in the real world. So we need to start all over again. And the question is, what are we doing? I mean, you know what it looks like. What are the principles by which we are working? And what is our sources of inspiration, since all prior architecture is in a sense bankrupt and we have to start from scratch again. So we're looking at nature. We're looking at, in nature, what we find is complex, variegated order. And we're inspired by images like this. There's a lot of richness and variety, but there's also the lawfulness of the laws of nature interacting, different subsystems coming together and creating form lawfully. Or these, big river delta, or organic nature. These are all examples we cherish, the kind of, you see the range of scale and size and the global pattern, the gradients. All of these are characters of that complex variegated order we're looking for. And there's one precursor who has been doing some of that through going to nature and using physical processes to generate form. That's the great German engineer architect Frei Otto, who started this work even in the 60s, 70s, 80s. In the end, he even got kind of computational support, but he was limited, of course, in his fabulous work to what he could study with physical models. And we're going beyond that now, and we're creating a second nature which is no longer limited by the physical models and by real physical processes, but we can simulate simulate artificial processes and generate parameters outside of the natural ranges. I'm just showing you now a few images, I'm going to go quickly, of the way we work at the AADRL in terms of starting with physical models and physical form finding, and then moving from there into digital processes in which we explore the world further. But you can see the richness of forms. This is like the endless forms of nature. And they're produced by students in exploring materials, exploring the elasticity of materials, exploring gravity, viscosity, tension, material texture, and generating materials by knitting geometries into material textures, which are also with the idea of continuous differentiation. And it's just it's a great laboratory of developing these forms and processes and inventing these kind of second nature. And we're usually working from the physical into the digital and then back into the physical. And there's no end to what you could choose and work with. And of course, then there's issues of scaling, but it's all about finding principles of material computation, which could then be translated into digital computation and simulation. So this is the world of kind of quasi-nature. This is the kind of architecture which comes out of the office. And again, I'll show you these digital results. And now I want to formulate the principles positively. So we had crossed out a series of negatives and called them negative heuristics, the taboos, what you no longer do. Now we want to tell you what you always have to do. I'm calling these also the dogmas or the positive principles. Positively, in terms of these rigid forms, all the forms are soft. That means they have degrees of freedom. They're parametrically variable. And so we're starting with a torus, but we then is searching a search space, a space of possibility with a form which can take different shapes. And there's always many, many varieties and variations which we explore. There's never one idea, I'm going to do a circle, but there's a whole kind of range of modulations and manipulations. And then something comes out, maybe a piece of furniture. But more importantly is that when we work this way, we can give that exploration of ranges of options certain intelligence. We can pre-constrain it with the need, for instance, to follow a certain structural logic, shell logics, like the catenary model, similar to the Gaudi physical model. And now we can still play with the parameters. What are the sizes? How many of these come together? What is the gravity assumption, the material assumption? So we still have enough degrees of freedom to play and search a universe of possibility while having now already fixed some rational criteria. So whatever we come out of this, it will be structurally sound. It will be structurally efficient. And we can impose further constraints, fabrication constraints, for instance, or further constraints, environmental constraints, and then with these constraints search. So that means soft forms intelligent, or pre-constrained forms, and then we're creating forms like this. So once the individual elements are parametrically variable, once we start looking at arrays and systems of these elements, we're looking at differentiating rather than repeating isotropically. Just need to activate this. So again, the individual element is parametrically variable, but when it arrays, it differentiates the field, so the variation is not randomly applied, but it is applied according to a coherent law or gradient law, which might have to do, for instance, with sun exposure and a shading element. And then you have a kind of differentiation which is intelligent because it registers, for instance, shading requirements which change as you move around a curvilinear surface, which also curves in section. And this is another example here where we take a large towers, by the way, we're just completing this one in Beijing, and we can integrate engineering information and data. So these are sun exposure maps which are applied to the volume. That information can then be transcoded through, that's your creative act of the designer, to invent some kind of transformation algorithm and invent a geometry which can receive that difference. And then you write an automatic translation from the sun exposure map into a differentiated geometry, which you can invent various ways, of course, of doing this. But this one is again an intelligent differentiation of a system or subsystem with an intelligent performative input. And I think it's important here also to distinguish parametricism as a style which comes with particular desire for differentiation from the mere application of the tool, which, for instance, somebody like Norman Foster, a kind of modernist still, I would argue, is using. He has to use a parametric system here because each joint is actually its own unique angle, and he invented a kind of generative component we can adapt to different geometric conditions. But his intention is to use parametric to deliver kind of what I call a kind of neutralization of the differences. He wants this to be looking very even as possible, even though it is locally very, very different. And our spirit is very different. That's why it's not only technique, but a kind of artistic desire, a style, a set of values. We like the conspicuous amplification of difference. We like this kind of space. And I think under this space where you have differences, I think it is also representing much better the way contemporary society operates. We are not just one big mass in one space, but we are differentiated in different lifestyles, different groups, different ages, different professions, different patterns of interaction, and they can find themselves in such a space which is differentiated, where the differences become very clear between singular ribbed, grid ribbed, more densely coded. So we love this. This is also a desire to use tools with the intention to differentiate radically. And that differentiation also applies to urbanism. And again, initially it is just, I would call it a gratuitous differentiation. That means we don't necessarily have in advance reason why we are differentiating. We just say our default condition is differentiation, rather than offering a client or city 100 equal in the same block. We give them 100 different ones, and then we let society sort which one, who would like to be in the larger, and the medium size, the smaller size, and so on. And there's a kind of ordering which is also sometimes a discovery of potentials, as well as some pre-imagined differentiation. So differentiation is with reasons, but also without reasons, and then the reasons come later. The final and most powerful principle is the principle of correlation. So once we have these subsystems which are differentiated, we have to imagine that every architecture has more than one subsystem. There's going to be different layers. In the urban texture there will be fabric and circulation and fenestration. In the building there will be skeleton, internal divisions, envelopes. So there's always multiple subsystems. Each is differentiated, but it was important that they correlate. So that, for instance, the way the one system of balls is being reacted to by a system of chips in this case, so there's always action-reaction correlation between the different subsystems. That's very, very important. And that is in contrast to what I said earlier, the taboo where things remain unrelated. Here we need to create these relationships. We create these associative logics. And there's an example. So here we have the first system is a system of surfaces in the Gongju Opera House. And the surface ripples, creates the balconies, creates the lighting gantry. And then there's a second system, the swarms of lights, which correlate, which settles into these surfaces, always at, for instance, at the more horizontal zones, the undercroft zones. And there's another set of textures on the left, the kind of relief. Again, there's a correlation between, in this case, surface and lighting swarm. Or here, where the tower interacts with the ground condition. It's not just sitting there flat without anything happening. When the tower enters the ground, it creates a crater. Every action has a reaction. And here again, there's differentiation in the tower section. So there's a square section becoming a T section, becoming an H section. And when we apply the facade, there's a correlation, a transfiguration or transformation, again from the facade from something closed to more of an office curtain wall, to more of a kind of balcony system, based all on the hexagonal. So there's a kind of two subsystems differentiated and correlated in a coherent way. And I think you can also enact that with associative logics and in parametric models like this, where a lot of these geometries are pre-linked together and react to each other, and follow each other and work together. So it's important that we always have multiple subsystems which come together. And here's another example from a student project. And some of these projects are quite old. These principles have been the same for 10, 15 years. So I can pick examples from 10 years ago or from last year. Maybe the last year ones are more refined. But you can see here the skeleton initially one thing is certain, it should be differentiated from the ground moving up, because forces and structural forces are much heavier on the ground, the loads, the moments, and there must be differentiation up the axis. Now if the tower starts to react to another tower and is bending, complicated, at the top you can see we're using finite element analysis, stress analysis, and then what we're doing? We then use this information to make a more subtle differentiation of the skeleton. So we're generating an algorithm which translates the stress diagram of the volume envelope into a point diagram and then a structural network diagram. So that develops a skeleton. Then we develop the idea of openings, the idea of the floor plates reacting and pulling away from the openings, the idea of ribs which react, configuration of the recesses and the interaction of the core with the outer envelope. And this will be building up these subsystems, and you can see what happens. There emerges a kind of natural beauty because there's differentiation and correlation, like in nature, where, for instance, the vegetation grows onto a topography and does that in a coherent way, in a differentiated way. And later we can perceive that as elegant and beautiful and well ordered, and we can also navigate this because we can read, for instance, the topography through the vegetation. We can find the river in the forest because it follows the topography, etc. So there's a kind of well orderedness which makes the built environment more beautiful and more legible, more navigable. And here the next layer comes in, the facade, which recognizes, again, voids pulling away. And so you get an orchestration of the different subsystems. I think we recognize this as a very powerful beauty, that complex organization. So this, in summary, we have three negative principles: no rigid forms, no simple repetition, and no collage of isolated, unrelated elements. And three positive demands and principles, which in a sense are the inverse: all forms are soft, all systems differentiate, and all systems to be correlated. And what is very important, that this brings that intensification of relation, but also I think what I wanted to say here is you can use these principles to critique your project and have a good heuristic to always improve your project, enhance your project, enhance its intensity and beauty. So usually there might still be elements in your project which are too rigid. They're not really inflected, not informed. You have still forms of simple repetition in your project. So you can think of how can I differentiate further? How can I give my elegance more degrees of freedom? And in particular, what you can always improve, you can always correlate more. You can always let everything communicate with everything else. It's an infinite project. So if you've allowed your skeleton to correlate to the envelope and to the interior, maybe you haven't yet correlated with some exterior context. Maybe there's a further element of context. Maybe there's something in the underground. Maybe there's a road coming in which your project should react to. So it is always, you can always do more. And you know that with these principles, you can always enhance the intensity and beauty of your project. Of course, it's difficult. The more you have already interacting, the more any new element needs to pick up all these relations without destroying them. But what is good about this, I call it a heuristic. These are principles where you know how to improve your project. And the more you work, the more powerful and beautiful will your project be. And of course, this applies to urbanism as well. So we're showing you just some of these urban projects and how we've been working at DRL, for instance. This one is a simple system project, and there's a simple real floor algorithm, which has to, you can see to some extent how it interacts with the outer shape and incoming roads and creates a very interesting diversification internally. This one is more interesting. It uses, for instance, three fluids which interact and generate beautiful dynamic patterns. Then there's this transcoding again. You take that information of the fluids and you transcode it into these voxels, all fluids in one way, or you do one fluid as a voxel, the other fluid as a continuous surface. And there's a lot of freedom. The same fluids generate now these different architectures, multi-systems. You can rerun the fluid, or you can switch transcoding. And in the end, all of these different morphologies, there are 3 or 4 morphologies, each follows one of the data sets of the fluid and generates that complex variegated order we recognize. Or another one where you have swarms of elements, and then there's a correlation of the elements with the networking script. And in the end, we generate something like this. Very rich, intricate, generates a unique identity, is never boring, is always different, but it's also ordered and navigable. It's not that visual chaos that urban garbage spill we talked about earlier. So this is one of our projects, the Istanbul Master Plan, and you can see here that we're creating something radically new, but it also embeds into an existing context. We used for the street system, going back to some of Otto's experiments with bundling and clustering lines through viscosity of water. So we did this with the Maya Hair dynamic engine, and you can see here that we wanted to pick up all the little streets from the context, but the new territories cannot be that fine-grained. So we started to bundle these streets according to a logic, and then we have done major line cutting north-south. So we generated and abstracted this into a series, into a soft grid with some of these bundlings, and then we filled some new kind of fabric, and we worked with two types, a block type and a tower type, the cross tower type. And then we allowed these two types to also become similar to each other. So we're starting with difference and then we assimilate them to each other. So the cross tower and the block create a kind of quasi-tower. And this way we generate a kind of lively texture. You can also see there's a correlation between the overall shape of the new territory, where it is becoming narrow in the middle, it pushes the towers up. So the elevational profile gives information about the plan expands. So this is very important, that these kind of transformations give information, that they make the project legible, navigable, and that you can draw inferences from what you see to what you don't yet see. And that makes it for good orientation. And you can also see here that we then go into detail when we're zooming in to the block. You can see that the facade relief on the outside street is very deep, and in the inside courtyard is very shallow, and that they're transitioning from the public space to the more private space. You can follow a kind of facade relief, so there's some kind of semiology which explains where you are in the system and which way you're moving in the system. You're moving into the interior of a private domain. So this was the principles, some of its important illustrations. And I want to just click through how this applies to design, for instance. Just opened a design gallery in our London office. So we're giving ourselves a public face, two-story public showroom, and to just show you what we have on show. We're creating these kind of complex environments, three-dimensionally complex furniture pieces, sofas. They're always freestanding, interactive, they create fields. Sometimes they're quite abstract still, because these are experimental furnitures. They kind of hover somewhere between sculpture and furniture, because when you're trying to develop new forms and new functions together, you might sometimes have to phase it. You work on the new form first and then think of a new function later. And you're just also exploring ways of making forms. This is a freestanding desk, tables. And just click through some of those images of our gallery. Big new glass table. And we're using that space also to have a lot of events. I think communication is very important. We have parties, we have shows, we have fashion shows, a space of interaction. And we always do that. For instance, this year at the Milan Salone Mobile, the big international furniture fair, we've launched 12 new projects. So we like to be present at these events, and we created our own space, filling it with, for instance, with this new set of sofas, and launched a new auditorium seat, etc. Sometimes we like also a whole range of furniture pieces come together to create a space, rather than being acting one by one. So there's a kind of a lounging area, shelving area, a freestanding piece coming together to generate a kind of total environment. And a collection of elements belongs together, a swarm of stools, armchair, a cabinet, a chaise longue, the shelving elements, they all create some kind of collection of elements which works together. We call it the seamless collection in this case. The cabinet is interesting. It's again freestanding. We don't like things often only pushed against the wall. And the drawer pulls out and then sucks in from the other side. Sometimes we also create objects. We don't have a very fixed and unique purpose. You don't know what it is, but maybe it's a seat, a table, a storage unit. It is a kind of enigmatic object which is thrown into kind of, for instance, gallery for social use, and social clubs we're generating. And they're kind of interactive. As soon as you pull away the stereotypical things, oh yes, this is a table, this is a chair, and I'm sitting at the table, this is a sofa. You can generate more interaction, more interesting social situations. So I think it becomes innovative. We're creating this big bar piece, but also more product like lamps and chandeliers. We're getting into car design, kitchen, outdoor furniture, and then migrating into nearly sculpture, or is it benches? We don't know. It's just filling the world with this kind of new organic material and inviting users to interact with it. Going into fashion is very important. I think the fashion system is also about creating new sensibilities, new self-expression, and I think also parametricism will have a role in this. I'm currently working on my suits, and I'm working on a new outfit. It's great fun. So we're working with shoes. We're working with these new shoes that's just been launched. They're great. They're quite light. This looks like stainless steel, but it's actually metallized rubber. You can run with them. They're very kind of comfortable, but they're 15 centimeter. They push you up by 15, so it's pretty cool. And we go into jewelry and fashion. Now, some of the projects which I started showing, the projects which have been completed, you might have seen published. This is what is being under construction and in completion. It's a kind of amazing villa in Moscow, which has a series of low spaces carved into the ground, and then pulling up the bedrooms to be above the tree lines. It is in Moscow, just finishing, all cladded in fiber concrete. And we're currently working on the interiors. So it's very adaptive to the conditions. It kind of works with the topography of the ground, and it works with the datum of the tree lines, tree house up there, you see later, and always connections, visual connections between the interior and exterior. And up there it's quite beautiful, I'll show you. So this is some of the way we work on the interior, very fluid. And this is now working and developing the bedrooms up there with a fantastic view across the forest. And we work, every single element is uniquely designed. So we created this bed, we're creating the cabinets, we're creating the bathroom. Everything is tailor-made and fitted together in that new kind of piece of art. Another project we just finished, I click so quickly. What is interesting here is it is kind of flow lines and all applied in sections. So this project works through section only, and you move and you can see before you enter the building where you're going to flow through in sectional. And certain things push out, which are major prominent things, like the auditorium pushes out. Underneath is the entrance. There's a sky garden you can find, and beautifully detailed, all in concrete. And we love kind of robust and fluid material like concrete, and you can step in and flow sectionally through the building and interact exterior interior. There's a library and public administration building in France. Another building which is on site, it's a library for the Economics University in Vienna. And it's similar again, working very sectionally, in this sense, two interacting institutions, the library and the student center. And it's happening, and I love these kind of spaces where you can see many things simultaneously, where you look across levels, where things are above, below, and all around, and in depth layered into space. That characterizes most of our projects. We have these kind of atrium structures, but it's not only one atrium. One atrium leads to another, to a canyon, leads yet to another space where you look back, down, deep, up, across. That's very important, that communicative sensibility. What we need in today's network society, where we stay in touch, enter a building like this, and we see what everybody else is doing rather than hiding in a little cell. So this has been realized. So these are now the photos on site of what is happening and how these things interact, intercut, and create these wonderful fluid communication space. And I think libraries are very important kinds of buildings in the knowledge society, where we need to stay in touch, need to be connected. Of course, we stay connected through the mobile phone, the laptop, but what is great at the mobile phone, we can now take all our computing network with us. We don't have to hide at home. We can roam around in a public space, in the urbanism. So that makes this urbanism much more connective. We're not locked into a room. We can roam and browse the urban environment to find new partners of interactions, encounters, and to network continuously out there with people. And I call these surfaces interfaces of communication, which of course are much more rich and dense and versatile than that little screen. I keep one piece of information on the screen, I get potentially hundreds of pieces of information in that rolled out in the urban environment. And all of these are interfaces of communication. Even in our towers, where we adapt them to local climates, etc., we have a kind of big atrium we're navigating through. We avoid these kind of isolation into individual plates and spaces. And we like this kind of navigation from the ground into the tower and be able to follow that. So when you move through here, you can already be drawn towards the tower, you can see the tower, and you connect up to the tower. This is all about navigation, orientation, and seeing what comes next, and therefore not wasting time by running down blind corridors. That's very important. And so we're developing these towers and clusters of towers which have these atria often and reveal what's happening inside. New tower in Miami. And again, we like today to use the structure and skeleton to give identity to the project, to differentiate it. There's more structure at the ground that then bifurcates and becomes lighter to the top, but we also align it with 3 apartments in the lower areas, 2 apartments in the middle section, and 1 apartment per floor in the top section. So it also, there's a structural logic and then a functional logic follows and adheres to that, and then we vary the balcony condition and so on. So it's being very beautifully differentiated, very rational products. There's nothing irrational about it. It's actually presenting a very kind of clear logic and structural performance as well. And this is a kind of mature work, so we now have matured with our principles and ways of working that we can take on commercial clients, big projects, mixed-use projects, residential towers, office towers. There's an office tower designed for New York, where we connect the podium into the shaft, and again expressing the skeleton, having a great atrium and the sky garden as communicative spaces. So you step in and you, through a big arch into the fantastic atrium, you arrive at the sky garden. So it's very communicative and very legible in the exterior also what happens. And applied to a larger research campus. This is the Environmental Energy Research Campus in Riyadh, based on hexagonal arrays. And hexagons are interesting. They have more neighbors than squares or cubic elements. And then we still managed to differentiate them in size. So these are early computational studies of the field. This is a later developed project. And we're working here with a very strong environmental agenda. So we're having very hermetically closed volumes with courtyards oriented north and staggering in height to scoop the wind in. So it's very much a morphology developed from environmental logics, of course as well programmatic logics. Very, very deep and small windows, and then this indirect light through the kind of courtyards. So that hexagonal shape, which is in plan, operates also elevationally, so there's a legibility from the elevation with respect to the plan. And we have these kind of covered areas where we use again the hexagon, but this time we use the fluid tensile structure to shade. There's a lot of steel there, and there's a lot of geometric complexity. Now you could kill yourself trying to draw this, right? Thank God we have parametric systems, right? And if there's a change, you can let the machine recalculate all of that. But it's still a lot of work. I mean, we have a big team on this one to control. But of course, as the construction industry invests in these parametric systems as well for fabrication, these become manageable projects. Every single thing is different. And more opera houses and conference center. Now, if you showed earlier was the movie of the Changsha project. This is in Changsha in China. It's a complex. You can see here we like larger complexes of building, not just singular building, like the Riyadh campus. Here we have a cultural site, an opera house, a museum, a multi-purpose hall, and kind of programmatic landscape with some retails and recreation area. And then there's a commercial center with offices and retail, all together creating a kind of ensemble. And again, it's a super ambitious project. It's maybe the biggest of the cultural projects currently under work. We're working on it with our Guangzhou office at the moment. We started in London, and it's an amazing effort. And I just clicked through it. You saw the movie earlier. It's the opera house, it's the museum. But the importance here is to have coherency and continuity across building. And you saw this animation earlier, and I want to show also the Galaxy project, which we've recently completed in China. And here I want to demonstrate what I was talking earlier about. So each of these volumes is different, they connect differently. There's a relationship to context. There were ideas like this terracing to translate, to find also a buildable way to translate that fluidity. There's a metaphor of the galaxy, but what more important is actually the creation which we really end up with, rather than analogies to be drawn. And I was criticizing earlier that in Asia, people like analogies to justify their projects, and even when we come to Asia, we feel compelled to do that. But what is, and this is also a fascinating contrast, by the way. But what I'm trying to get at here in the project, which is fascinating, is these kind of vistas, this space of communication that you see deep into the space on different levels, above, below, all around. That is very immersive, and there's always many things to look at. With each step, something new comes into view, something new to strategize. And this is a very interactive community, because this is for very small upstart companies, for startups, sorry. Literally thousands of companies, because there's very, very small units. Everything below that bridge level is retail, and above is office. And we love this kind of world of moving through. It keeps changing, but this has a certain logic. You know what it means for the bridges to connect the retail areas. There's a lot coming into view. That is that surface, that interface of communication I was talking about earlier, instantiated. That simultaneity of interaction activity on the exterior, but also when you move closer, you move into the project, this continues. There's always views across level, across bridges. There's soft corners, there's glass corners, and there's an enormous communicative potential. And there's 4 of these major atriums. I think it's very successful, and we're very happy also to start addressing not only these kind of rare cultural iconic projects, but everyday work scenarios and work environments that we're getting into ourselves. This project is happening, and this will open in early March. It's the Dongdaemun Design Center, so it's a design museum, a design exhibition center. And what is interesting here is the integration with the parkscape, which we created as well, where the park goes down to -1 and moves up onto the roof, moves through the building. Building is very fluid. It sits in a complex context. It adapts to that. It creates a kind of powerful image in the city. It draws you in with that cantilever. There's actually a negative -1 space under the cantilever. And you can see that it is beautifully constructed, in fact. This is with reprogrammable molds, pin machines. So we also have now manufacturing techniques which can make double curved panels, each different, without having unique molds, but having a reprogrammable mold. And there's also what's beautiful that instead of windows, we have perforations, and then windows are behind the perforations. So there's a kind of unification of the envelope, but there's a lot of light coming in once you on the inside. So I think it works very well. And the final project I want to show in terms of our work is this project, the Baku project. And I think that demonstrates that we are increasing our virtuosity, and we're operating on a larger scale with more radical fluidity. We also have the good luck to integrate that whole parkscape. So we're having three components. You can see the museum in the front, that peak in the back is the library, and then the conference center to the right. And it bleeds into a plaza. So there's a continuity of surface between exterior ground surface into wall surface into roof surface, and there is different exterior spaces connecting. So it's a network of exterior spaces accumulating in a grand interior. Here's the main entrance in that cut, but you can see also on the right the way there's secondary spill-out areas for the conference center. There's the back side, there's another spill-out for cafeteria. So it looks very different from each side, but it's recognizable. It opens up in different ways to different sides. At night, the main entrance, and you can see here where the surface bleeds into the ground. Sometimes very solid and very hermetic, sometimes very open. The backside up to 80 meter. We like that. Sometimes you kind of really swoop upwards. Some of these cuts to orient views for the library. The structure was a continuous space frame in shell action, so there's no columns anywhere. So wherever we need come down, where the span becomes too large, we dip down and lift up again. That also motivates a courtyard in the center. So the entrance situation, you see up in that wormhole, that's these kind of vistas we love, all the way to the top floor of the museum, up there. These connections. The drift, the swoop of the light like swarms up the ceiling, and this is the view into the library, again into that tip. And everywhere we go, you have views above, below, inside, outside. There's a kind of interaction and networking of all the spaces. Everything communicates with everything else, which we love. Big ramps, you see the way the staircases bleed into the wall and become the lighting. So things kind of translate into each other, and that makes for an interesting unity of space. Rather than adding different things together into a collage which falls apart, we're using formal systems which modulate and transform themselves into different functional conditions, if you like. That window there is a kind of conic section. There's a courtyard behind, the view to the outside as well. You can see here that behind the window is the structure coming down and lifting up. Here that cut is a conic section again into the courtyard, views to the different directions of the outside. The library kind of scaling up into that tip. The area of the conference hall, different hidden spaces, back to the lobby area, and the wooden structure. You can see also, again, the staircase at the edge are peeled into the surface, so step becomes side ribbing, becomes lighting, becomes stage. So you can see here the handling of the staircases and steps before the seats come in. I think we can maybe stop here and start the Q&A, and if there's further questions we can go further. I can illustrate perhaps this later on. So anyway, thanks for the attention so far.
I've been thinking about this a lot. For example, let's play a game. Let's say everybody accepts this idea of parametricism, and all the building industries, as well as people around the world, accept that this is the way to build, and the type of city or urban structure results that you've always dreamt of.
That's right.
What kind of life would happen in your ideal state? What is a lifestyle where architecture that's kind of completely controlled by parametricism is in existence?
That all makes sense because I'm assuming that society has evolved a new collective lifestyle. I call this, and it's also a new ways of work, because after all, we become, as a civilization, we become richer, become more productive, safer lives, but we still need to sustain that through further productivity increases. We have also lots of challenges, environmental challenges, which we can only address if we become more productive, more knowledgeable. So I'm thinking it often from the point of view of the work and life continuity, which I call network society we're living in. So in the modernist society, we had a much stronger separation between work and leisure. Our work was mostly routine in a hierarchy of instruction, and quite repetitive, could be 10, 20 years more or less the same. What I've learned at university I can apply for the rest of my life. Now we're in a situation where we have to reinvent ourselves, potentially, quite often, where we have lifelong learning and we're not working so much under instructions, but often self-initiated. Even if we're in a corporate environment or in a company, the bosses don't know what we should be doing. So we need to communicate with each other, as well as with outside suppliers, as well as maybe with the university. We need to get new inspiration. To be productive every day, we need to be networking and stay in touch and communicate with many different people, with peers, with competitors, with colleagues. We're just browsing randomly just to be inspired, to see what anybody else is. Anything could be relevant. We need to be permanently on 2 or 3 mobile phones, online and Facebook. We need to, but also we need to see what's going on in the city. We need to be tuning in.
So everybody's
and
linked. Everybody's linked.
That linkage is, I think, what our architecture delivers. You saw the spaces, what you can see everybody else is doing, that voiding out, and also making navigable and legible, because we're now moving through the urban space, less than being locked, precisely because we stay connected. We don't have to be in front of our telephone. So that's what I see. I see very kind of dynamic, high density. Also, I think we need to be in big cities. And cities becoming bigger and bigger. And the little smaller and secondary cities, they're not productive. If you're stuck there, you're provincial, you can't participate. So I think there's a huge concentration process into the big mega cities, which become dense and full of life. And that's what our architecture is for. I think that's what our architecture can help. Still be that these big cities don't become menacing, that become visual chaos, that I'm kind of, in a sense, under the big garbage spill. We need to order that, make that elegant, make that legible, make that beautiful. And I think that only parametricism can do that. You develop the model, you transition spaces into each other, so that you can follow this link, you can follow this link, you can follow this link, rather than cutting everything. And then you need to also, of course, you explore. As you model, you continuously with your camera in the project, and you see this connection, there's also a visual connection, and there's kind of physical connection. And I think spaces need to become more open and less kind of cut into small cells. But you still need to, you cannot create an endless vastness, so you need to structure and differentiate. I think you do that intuitively when you model, and then you strategically test through vistas, through views, whether these exciting moments are in the project. How is an entrance opening up and unraveling a project for you? And there are still certain zones, yes, where it quiets down, where there's a smaller group, temporarily maybe encapsulated. But I think, yeah, you just need to know what you want, what you like, that you're thrilled by this kind of multi-layeredness, and that you like the layeredness and complexity. And then you will reach there in your design process. I don't feel this is chaotic. If you had this amount of different spaces and you use modernism and you just add things, or deconstructivism, then it becomes that chaos. So my argument is parametricism can increase complexity while maintaining order, whereas other styles, when they increase complexity, they generate disorder.
Well, it's interesting because we had a question at the morning session that asked Patrik what the atmosphere was like when he first joined Zaha Hadid Architects in 1988. And society was very different then, because things were very disjointed, and Zaha came along with a very radical idea of blowing things apart, exploding them, because you can't create continuity anymore, you can't create connections anymore. But now, it seems to me, it's almost the opposite of that, because fluidity now is trying to connect all the different parts that Zaha used to say should be exploded. Could you talk about when you first came, what the ideas of the office are and how it's led to
actually, I would say a little bit different from what you're saying is the era is modernism, that simple order of minimalism or modernism, which creates order by making everything the same or aligning it on the axis or on the grid. That becomes kind of, then you know what you can expect, but it's also very monotonous. That was rejected because it was too simplistic. Society wanted to be more dynamic, more complex. The next stage was this deconstructivism, where things were just exploded, were rammed into each other, layered. what I call the garbage spill was better than the monotony. But I think when Zaha entered, the way she fragmented, the way she layered was already starting to be different. For instance, it wasn't just the kind of Liebeskind crash of geometry. She was more interested in an explosion which had acceleration, which had a curvature. So if you curve the fragments and they accelerate, then you have a gradient order and you have a global figure emerging. The use of the way she did this, she used perspectival projections and fisheye projection to unify the fragments and to use curvature instead of hard angled to start. And this was the glimpses of that. And that we refined that. So I think when she came in, there was already that urge of, and people reacted to us finding it more beautiful. And that's because we brought up appreciating nature and living in nature, where you do have richness, but you never have the disaggregation of the garbage spill. You don't have the crash. It's always kind of growth and interaction. And that's what you react to as beauty. And it was somehow in Zaha's work, even in the deconstructivist work, it had more coherence, the work of people like Liebeskind or Tschumi or Koolhaas, who was her. And that's why she very soon, even as a young student, where she was starting to compete with some of her peers, she managed to win over some of these competition early on. Yeah.
Question is, it's about process of design. How do you make decisions as to how to proceed with the idea of kind of this fluid space? How do you make decisions as to which direction to go when you're presented with different types of projects?
The one is what I call constraints, which come through the engineering input. So I have this whole world, and I'm putting in the engineering, I'm selecting those which are structurally more efficient and feasible. But I still have a lot still to choose. There are those which are environmentally better suited in terms of volume to surface ratio. Of course, there's also the kind of pragmatics of program, sizing up of the overall and the tight fitting of the program. So these are called technical constraints, organizational constraints, and these are the ones which I would recommend to build into the algorithm, so that when you then play with them, you know that these are covered, and the next set of criteria is intuitive, it is aesthetic, and it is imagining the life process. It's not arbitrary, it's about trying to understand what would work better for the social scenarios, for the users, for the understanding of space, for the feeling of space. This is what is really our core competency. How is the space communicating? How it makes itself transparent? And I am now, and I'm not showing it here, trying to help with this idea of understanding space by modeling crowds into the spaces, into the models. So the technical requirement is there, but the kind of social understanding of space, we're trying to visualize it with crowds moving through, gathering, distributing, because we have to imagine the life process. And that imagination of the life process, I think, it should be and can be the selection process. And that is also helped by an aesthetic sensibility. If you have the right sensibility, you will pick the project which is works more beautifully later, because you'll have developed that right lust for complexity, for instance. You have to develop that intuition of wanting something which is well connected and vital and vibrant. So these are intuitive criteria that you need to have sensitivity and talent. It's difficult to operationalize that in terms of hard measurable criteria. So, and that's why we are we're not engineers. We're designers.
Have you ever encountered a project where it was built and then it didn't kind of answer the request of the clients, or it had a negative effect on their urban structure, where it wasn't successful in other people's eyes? But I'm going to add another question,
okay.
To be fair. Are there projects where you felt like once it was constructed, yes, you started to see glimpses of the opportunities of parametricism, So both cases, I think, would be much more interesting.
Yes, yes. I mean, thanks for the question. It's more positively surprised by how well the project works. I mean, the first building Vitra, I was very worried that there would be something catastrophically wrong once it's built. That certain things are simply not working, and I was very kind of pleased that it kind of came out well, and it was actually a functioning building, which was very much appreciated. And so far, yes, we can simulate, I think, enough through the 3D model, through the virtual building, through the vistas and fly-throughs, that there is a kind of, that the effects we're looking for will be there. But what I find interesting, there's always more things in the real building than you could have imagined, and mostly positive. I mean, of course, every building has some angles, views, corners. There are some basement areas, some back rooms where the coherence breaks down, and they don't belong to the kind of public sequence of spaces. And there is, in each project, you can make terrible photos where it doesn't make sense. And that means it's very difficult to have from all perspectives and all views. But it's also, when you make a photo of yourself, that you have to throw away half of it, right? Because it's going to be some kind of odd situation. Now, we did face some criticism in some of the projects, but mostly it's been very positive. I mean, surprisingly positive. I mean, this work is exhilarating. People love to be in an unusual space. They're very cheerful. They love to being strange and stimulated. And very, very little negative. There's some people question a bit. They want sometimes the project to be more similar to the context. I mean, we believe in a contextual embedding, which is picking up lines, geometries. Of course, we don't believe so much in making our building very much similar to the next door building. But if we build larger arrays, we want to make internal similitude. So sometimes we get criticized when we're saying this is not culturally sensitive, it's too strange. But I find that a lot of people love the strangeness, they love to be stimulated. It's like going to a different country to see things differently. So there is criticism, but I would say 5% criticism and 95% positive. And also for ourselves, we're always more surprised that there's nothing really terribly wrong with the project. Because these are unusual projects, they're very risky, because you don't rely on known formulas and known certainties. And we also sometimes worry if somebody, knocks their head or falls down a void, or, But so far there's been no major accident. In Vitra, we had this staircase with the gaps in the staircase. So actually, unfortunately, a small child fell through it. So. But that was the exception, and everything is okay with the kid, don't worry.
One is about building in a country that isn't very developed, and having to learn to adapt to the kind of local labor, and
Sure.
have you been in that situation? And number two, in circumstances where you are in a different country, do you use engineers that are on site, or do you have to kind of use your own specialized engineers to solve these problems?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, let's start with the engineering. We usually use initially London-based engineers. Then we often hand over or collaborate with local engineers. Of course, there needs to be interaction so that whatever the London engineers develop can be within code and can be picked up. And oftentimes the London engineers stay on as supervisors to some extent. With local labor, I find it interesting. It depends where we're going. Sometimes you have interesting craft capacities in countries, like in Morocco, for instance, when we're doing an opera house there. In terms of stone carving and cutting, we can actually use, and it puts us in an interesting position. Something we can only do there, which we would love to do, something complex and crafty. Then we use that. We also have a lot of, if we don't have that, we can often import small specialized subcontractors from Europe or the Middle East or wherever we find them. We have a network of those. We can bring them into the country maybe they can joint venture with a local company and train them up, and therefore integrate and upgrade the local expertise. I mean, I must say that we actually fascinated with the local vernacular architectures, because modernism, in a sense, although it made a fantastic uplifting of living standards globally, also made us lose some of the intelligence of vernacular architectures. When you can just import a glass box with the air conditioning machine, you make yourself independent from the environment, but you use a lot of energy, which becomes very unhealthy now. And in the meantime, all vernacular architectures did have pre-air conditioning ways of handling a climate with roof overhangs and cross ventilation and the use of materials which absorb and give away humidity and so on. So it's actually nice to study this. We discussed earlier that our work looks like organic work, so we're looking at biomimetics, but there's a similar, since the vernacular traditional architectures, primitive architectures, are evolved like organisms nearly, in a kind of trial error, selection, reproduction, perfection, rather than based on a science and a theory. We could also have a kind of vernacular mimetic research, and we do, particularly when it comes to climatic adaptation, which is still relevant today and more than ever. Other changes, cultural changes, are such that some of the building types of the tradition don't work anymore. But the technologies of environmental management are very fascinating, and so we do like that. Where we come across, we study that, and if there is local crafts, we sometimes use them, or we import very small specialized teams from abroad. I have to say that not too much of that. Why? I believe that in the preservation of ancient monuments and certain urban ensembles even, although some of that will compromise the vitality and evolution, they become kind of living museums. Sometimes it can coincide with kind of retail like Venice. And it still works. Venice still works today, but I believe that it's more of a tourism way, and the Italian population actually lives in Mestre and lives somewhere else. You can't really have a fully productive life in Venice. So I'm a skeptic when it comes to thinking that the new building has to be rooted in an ancient history. I think the new building has to be rooted in the contemporary culture of a place. I believe in place. I believe in local cultures, but in the contemporary local culture, and then believe in the necessity of architecture to evolve with that. And so I don't believe anymore in national cultures. I don't believe that there is, in a meaningful way, national architectures anymore. We live in a global network society, and where I think the different cultures is the difference between the financial sector, which you find in London City and Wall Street, and bankers and high-end business, versus the community of scientists and researchers in the physical sciences. They're different again from the sociologists and political theorists, which are different from artists and creative milieux, which are a little bit different from designers. So I think the different professions and industries develop cultures of certain spaces of communication, spaces of production, spaces of interaction, personas. There's the whole education sector, and students are different again. They dress different, they live in different kind of places, they have different lives. These are the cultures. But if I'm looking at student cultures and architectural students globally, I think they find a lot of similarity between the architecture students from Thailand with respect to China, to Europe, to Russia, to the Middle East. They all share a discourse, they share a vision, they share an ethos, a way of interacting, which is more powerful than the national roots. So that's what I believe. I believe in contemporary cultures which are different in different cities and different parts of cities with different populations. Sometimes you have also mixtures of cars coming together, and that's very much more important than representing an ancient culture. I mean, I have nothing particular important which roots me into kind of German Middle Ages or German when the German were German, right? In more inherently German, or should I go back into the, you know, before the Roman Empire, where we are truly isolated German tribes? I mean, I don't know if I have much connection. Actually, I escaped from Germany because it's too provincial. I had to be in London or New York. So I don't know if it makes sense. I mean, what should I be wearing? What should I wear? What house should I be living in? I mean, but you also need to know, of course, there is, so we're in the thicket of being a productive communicator and being in the world. I think we shouldn't be give into that kind of nostalgia. I think it's a different story when you go out as a tourist and you want to get a sense of former civilizations and cultures. There's still food cultures are different and so on. I mean, that's enjoyable. Or you make a resort and you make that more traditional, or you like the flavors of a. You don't want it to be everywhere the same. I accept that. But when it comes to in a university campus where you're researching and debating and in international discourse, actually I find it distracting if you go to Yale and you're in this kind of neo-Gothic, it really disconnects you. You want to dream about kind of Middle Ages and you want to read the Bible, you don't want to read, you know, I find it counterproductive, and you kind of, in your little, so I'm very much a skeptic of ancient cultures and history being so, but I'm very much cultural relevance, contemporary cultural relevance. Is it a kind of bohemian space where a lot of young radical people are coming together, or is it a kind of space where, you know, powerful decision makers with a lot of responsibility have to interact? They're very different spaces. That's where I'm coming from.
But then in your ideal world, where there is fluidity,
yeah.
What is a place of an ancient building in your ideal world where everything is smooth?
The urban environment is transforming. I don't believe in, like the modernists, they wanted to erase the old and start from new. I think we evolving an environment. So we adding, making incisions. Some of this can stay as reinterpreted, and I think parametricism is very powerful and good at this. Look at our Rome project. It captures some existing building and brings it into a new context. Now the new project in Hyde Park is an extension of an existing, and we're transforming. So I believe in that, and we are very good at that. And we can make sense. Or in our Istanbul and Singapore master plan, we're connecting into existing tissues. And an ancient project, if you throw it into, and in our site, we can work around that. We can actually make it conspicuous, frame it. And that's not by making similar and making it disappear in something similar, but by heightening and making it conspicuous through maybe contrast, through framing, through leading to the building. That's where we respect maybe an ancient building, not by imitating it. Right. I think it's a very good observation. I think that's why to innovate, that's why it's important to work with academic research, that you can focus on a research topic and investigate the consequences through radical extrapolation and through bracketing off other questions. That's you can make progress. In a real project, you're quite right. In a real project, you have all these criteria have to be played at the same time, and there's less a thematic focus. And so there we can't afford. It makes it much more difficult. That's why, in a sense, we need the student arena to prepare the themes, the agendas, the very innovative experiments, and we can then look at these, many different ones, and then select from that. Then there's a new project coming in. We say, oh, this project could be addressed by this research and by this research. and we have something. In a pure office environment, you don't have the time, and you can't make the project itself a vehicle of research, because the client wouldn't allow that. Because you wouldn't allow, for instance, to temporarily forget about the budget, or temporarily bracket off some fabrication issues. You bring them in later. In the academic, you can make this project only about diagrams and organizations. The next project you take similar and you focus on manufacturing and tessellation and so on. The next project, and none of the projects address all of these. But once you've gone through these, you have a project, and you have many researchers and many projects, you can match them up, some of them. That's the way it works. I think that's why I feel that I could not have developed this innovative and powerful work in the office without all this research. With our own students, and of course watching other researchers, Columbia University of the 90s, etc. So it's very, very important, and we have our own little research department, but it's far too small compared to the power of DOL, for instance, which is 60 people for 18 months. We have maybe 6 people in our research department.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you very much, Mr. Patrik Schumacher, for your time and attention. Giving him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks.